everybody. How's it going today? I am going to get started here. All right. So today, hello there. Hello. You can see me now. Hello. Today I am going to be talking a little bit about various ways that we can handle CSS in React. I've been at work lately kind of exploring a bunch of different ways to handle this and trying to figure out the best solution that works for our team. And in addition to that too, there's a lot of like philosophical CSS questions that end up coming up, right? CSS and JS being one of them. A lot of people have a lot of really strong opinions one way or the other about that. Certainly nothing wrong with that, but definitely something worth exploring and trying to figure out. I mean, the answer generally always ends up being like somewhere in the middle, right? Where, you know, there are use cases absolutely for CSS and JS, and there are absolutely points to be made as to why it may not work for a certain project or a certain team or a certain person. A lot of it ends up boiling down to personal preference. But what I wanted to do here today is just kind of go through the steps for implementing a couple of different strategies that seem to be fairly popular. One of them being CSS modules and the other being a CSS and JS solution called styled components. We'll kind of get into what they are, how they're different, and all of that here in a little bit. Just a little bit of preface here too. I spun up a couple of just default React applications on Code Sandbox. What we're going to do here today is just go through the setup for CSS modules first, figure out how to implement that while also using Create React App, which is just a template within Code Sandbox that essentially just runs the Create React App command and then gets everything all set up and stuff for you. I'm not going to go through that whole process, running through the command line, naming the project and everything. I just kind of want to get into how you can implement these two strategies on your existing site. Cool. So let me go ahead and show you my screen here. Cool. So yeah, like I said, you'll see these two tabs that I'm switching between. Nothing too crazy to start out with. Just kind of want to really discuss more of the, again, kind of like the philosophical stuff surrounding these two methods. So yeah, I will get started then. First things first here too, let me show you kind of what we're working with here. CSS Modules, React. That's not how you spell React, but that's okay. Adding a CSS module style sheet. Okay, so CSS modules is a strategy within a React application that we can use to essentially, it serves as a way to scope styles within components. So one of the problems that folks have had in the past with React applications is, you know, if you're working on a giant application that has a ton of different components with a ton of different styles, a lot of times what you're going to end up finding or encountering is a like clashing between your class names, right? So say you have, you know, a very generic like button class. For whatever reason, throughout your application, you use one of those button classes, and then you end up renaming it and or trying to use different styles somewhere. That button class, it can end up conflicting. I guess button is maybe a silly example. Try like card or something really generic like that. It is very possible and very easy to to conflict and to have another class somewhere else that affects your card class somewhere you didn't intend for it to be affected. So CSS modules essentially acts as a way to separate those things out and scope styles within components. So if you've used like Vue or anything like that before, you'll have experience with you'll have experience with Vue actually like generating a crazy class name that's like hashed and is completely unique to that component, and then outputting that as the class name. So that's what CSS modules do. That's a super quick run through about like all of the stuff that can that CSS modules can do for you. I did a lot of research on this initially, and really that is like the only purpose that I could tell that CSS modules serve, is to just act as a way to separate components, prevent your class names from clashing, and keep those styles scoped. If you have a different experience with CSS modules where it does other things that are incredibly helpful to your project, I'm super interested to learn how people use this type of stuff. So yeah, if you've had any experience with CSS modules that differs from what I just said, feel free to let me know either in the chat or in the comments, whatever. And we can talk about it a little bit more, because I am trying super hard to learn all of the things that I can. Yeah, my name is indeed Dom, short for Dominic. But yes, I was definitely born into this role, right? Cool. So yeah, I'm gonna get started going into our code sandbox. This documentation is straight from the Create React, like the Facebook GitHub. They have really good documentation on how to like add this type of stuff. So we can use this as a reference. I've not used Code Sandbox on the stream before, so bear with me a little bit while I try and figure out like how exactly to get all the dependencies and stuff in here that we need. But cool. So let's get into it. All right. So create React app. This project supports CSS modules along. Oh, does create? When I did this last, CSS modules was something you had to import. So maybe now you can just straight up import CSS and use them as CSS modules with Create React App. So let's give that a try, I guess. The way that I generally like to kind of start out doing stuff when I have like a new project like this is establish a folder structure and kind of like an organizational structure for the application. I just kind of have like a system that I like to just kind of use. So within our source directory, I'm just going to create another directory called styles. Within that styles directory, I'm going to create another directory called components. And in this little demo thing that I'm doing here, I'm just going to make like a really simple button that has some styles. It has like a little hover transition, that type of stuff, just so that we can see how these two things square up against each other. Not that it's necessarily like a competition between these two. It's just they do things a little bit differently. So within the components directory, I'm going to make a button.css file. I am going to rip out some of this stuff in the index, just our main app function. Just going to write a very simple button that says click me. And I'm also going to do, just to continue showing some of like the power of these two things, I'm going to make just like a little variation of the button that is, we'll just call it empty. I like, this is totally like a preference thing, but I like to use the RSCSS like naming convention for classes. This little dash here just denotes that this is a variation of a style. Totally preference, but something that I just will do throughout here. So they have a website if you're interested in that. It's just, I think it's just rscss.io. Yeah, so you can go here and kind of explore their naming conventions if you're, for whatever reason, like sick of BEM or you don't have a class naming convention that you abide by. Worth looking into. I just like the way that they lay their class names out in this strategy. All right, cool. So I've got a button, very generic, and then a button with a variation here. Let's, in code box, I'm not sure. Code sandbox, I'm not sure if I need to like save that before I do anything else, but it's saved now. So cool. So in, before we move on, I guess in index, you can see that they are importing like this styles.css CSS file within the app itself already. So I guess that does imply that we can use CSS modules already. I wonder, like, let's see. We're gonna learn this together and see how Create React App is handling this. But oops, not what I want to do there. Right. Okay. Yeah. So with styled components, generally, the way that you call like class names to be hashed and then output is through an import statement like this. But instead of just straight up importing the CSS file, you have to do like a named import. So we import styles from style.css. And then within this class name, instead of just writing your class name like it had before as app, just as like a normal string in quotes, you have to use JavaScript to, this essentially imports all of your styles as an object and then hashes those each individual class name from the top level. So like if we had another, and actually we'll talk about that when I get into the button stuff, but if I import styles from style.css, I should hopefully be able to do styles.app. In theory, let's do something in here that makes it really obvious. Background color red. Okay, it does not look like it is doing anything there. Okay. Adding CSS modules. Features available with React Scripts 2.0 and higher. We've got 2.1.8. Oops, that's the styled components. We've got 2.1.8. Import styles from styles.css. Just has a class name, whatever. You can import a regular one. Oh, I see. They have a specific way of naming. Create React App didn't do this to me the last time that I did CSS modules, but that's fine. It's cool. We're learning here together. So I guess just by default, let's just leave this alone and let it be a normal style sheet and just bring in style sheet by itself. Cool. So yeah, that's doing stuff. What we will do, however, is import this button.css as a styled component. So I will need to rename this to button. Button.module.css. And then let's see how that works. So by default, we're just going to create like a little button class that does a few things here. I styled out button offline here, and we're just going to kind of go through that real quick. So initially, let's just get this to work, right? So on a button with the button class, let's just get a background color of, this is my like brand. Got to stay on brand here, I guess. So we're just going to set the background color of a button with the button class to this pinkish color. We'll save that. Save all of these. Cool. One thing that is always kind of like a challenge is just organization of these types of things in general. I like to make sure that my imports for, like NPM packages or React itself, like high top level things that are required for your project or this file in particular to work, stay at the top. And then as we add styles, I kind of like to group them together a little bit here. So we'll just do import styles from components. I gotta go up a level. No, I named it styles. There we go. Styles, components. Oh boy, someone is at the door. Let's make sure we got this right. Okay, so we got to make sure that we output the whole path here. So we will do that. Button.module.css. Okay, hopefully this is being imported. I will add the class name here. Like I said before, it's not just going to be a normal string. We have to use it as an object. So styles.button. Sweet. There you go. So cool. That's good to know. It's imported. Everything's working fine. So when you do this on your own, don't forget that the syntax that Create React App uses by default, there are things that you can do to get it to just recognize any CSS file as a CSS module. But by default, it appears that Create React App requires you to name it .module.css, which not a big deal, I don't think. Cool. I'm going to move that down a line. I also got a new keyboard that is like, it's one of those super ergonomic ones. So I'm going to mistype a whole bunch of stuff, just forewarning. So, you know, cool. Sweet. So we've got that. Let's actually style this button out so that it doesn't look terrible. Add a border, pixel solid, the same color. This is something I don't know, and I'm going to try it and see what happens. I want to set this color to a variable. If I call this primary and make sure that that's hash. No, that's okay. I'll just set this as a CSS variable local to the button class. I've used CSS variables a ton, but I still have to Google it, so you get to see me be a human, I guess. There we go. Yep. Okay. So when I'm defining a variable here, it's just 2 dashes, primary. I'm just going to call it primary. And then add the hex there. Use the variable instead of the actual color here. Not car, not var. There it is, var. Dash dash primary. Lovely. Same thing here, dash dash primary. Lovely. Cool. So we got that. Set the color just by default to like a light, super light gray, pretty much white. We want this to be a cursor pointer. Nope. Pointer. I hate. Okay. Yeah. Doesn't matter. Cool. So we got that. Add some padding. 1 rem, 2 rem. I did not apply the reduce the button class to the empty variation. So we'll do that. This is one thing. So cool. We're already encountering a little bit of a weird thing with CSS modules. So CSS modules are interesting in that it's kind of a pain, or just maybe not necessarily a pain, but a little bit weird to add multiple styles to a button, or to anything. Oops. Nope. Okay. So we still need to go into JavaScript essentially and call the various objects in here, but instead of doing it just one at a time, we pretty much want this to be an array of these styles. So we'll do styles.button, actually. Styles.button and styles dot. A second weird thing. So because I'm using RSCSS, the dash, we can't add a dash empty to this object here because that's not like valid object syntax. Like it doesn't know what this means. It's an invalid character. So what we can do is instead of just doing styles.button, we would then go into another array from the styles object, and it ends up being a string within here where we do styles, not styles again, dash empty. And that got an extra, oh, what was it not liking that? Do they have to be consistent? Oh. I ran through this a little while ago and that worked fine. Interesting. It's an array, styles. Okay. Oops. Oh boy. Let's remove that for now. I'm just going to remove that for now. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I'm just going to finish these styles here. Let's increase the font size a little bit, like 1.54 rems. That's fine. Sure, nice and big. You can see them. Lovely. Can you folks see the text in here? Okay. Should I like blow up the text size a little bit? Let me know in chat if you can. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep going. Can I even do that through here? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. There we go. All right. No worries. We'll just keep moving along. Cool. So I've adjusted the font size. I'm just going to put this text transform uppercase. Make that look a little nicer. Let's add a hover state to this, where the background color by default goes to something like blackish, dark color. CSS modules by default don't add like CSS, like post CSS stuff to it. So I'm just going to kind of do this the old school normal CSS way, which is madness. I know. Button hover. All right, cool. So on hover, like I said, I want a background color. We'll just do 111. Border color, same thing, 111. Terrific. Lovely. Let's transition that. Background color 300 ease 300 milliseconds, and then border color ease 300 milliseconds. Look at that, nice and smooth, lovely. Cool, so we've got a hover state. Let's add the variation for our empty variation and then figure out how to actually get that imported. So button with a variation class of empty. Instead of any background color, we're just going to do background color transparent. And because that's on a white background, you're not going to be able to see the text, so we'll change the color to a dark gray. Let's do 666. And then we want the hover state. Oh boy. The hover state to be something more along the lines of a super light gray. We'll just do ease. Call that good. And gosh, dang it, we can't. You get used to those fancy things in like post CSS that allow you to do nesting and variables and stuff like that super easily. I am spoiled by that, but I don't want to focus too much on that, so we'll just keep writing it normal. Great. Okay, so we got our button. It's styled. It's got something in there. So with CSS modules, the kind of the moral of the story here right now up to this point is that you're just going to be writing normal CSS in a normal CSS file. There's nothing super crazy complicated about this method of organizing your CSS. Very much what you would be used to if you were working on a static site in WordPress, whatever project you're working on. The syntax is all the same. It's just a normal CSS file. There's nothing crazy to it. The only weird thing ends up being how you call your class names in the actual application itself through this styles object. Cool. Okay, so let's figure out why in the world. Oh, it was probably not working because we didn't have empty defined, right? Let's hope that that's the case. It needs to be, needs to be in a string styles.empty. Let's just remove the attachment to button. Empty. You are not liking that dash, which is frustrating for me. Really? Okay, let's go to Google. CSS modules, add multiple classes. I'm sure this is something a million other people. This is conditional. Let's, oops, no. Multiple class names to an element. Oh, okay. Well, wait. I mean, that's pretty much what I'm doing here, right? I guess we can do it in a template literal. Let's see what that does. I think it had parentheses on it already. Yeah. Button. And then styles. Why are you upset? Oh, I'm missing a... Oh boy. Missing an ending. That is Z, Dom. Come on now. Here we go. Okay, so styles. And then let's see if this will let me add... I guess it'll just be empty at this point, right? Because we removed the dash. Unterminated regular expression. I need an extra. Oh boy. Okay, that was a bit of a pain there. Sorry about that. Cool. So there we go. We have our basic button styled, classes applied, multiple classes applied. It frustrates me that it won't let me do a dash here, because that is my preferred method of class naming, and I would really appreciate it if it just did the thing that I wanted it to. Great. Okay, so it does. I wonder if there was just an issue with the way that the array was handling. Oh, you have to join it with a space. That's a little bit weird. Template literals are the way to go. Template literals are great for absolutely everything, and they are apparently great for CSS modules as well. Awesome. Cool. So that is kind of the gist of CSS modules. I don't want to spend too much more time going through unless anyone has any questions or anything in particular, very specifically about CSS modules, I'm happy to switch back to this if you're watching and you have a question about it. Happy to talk through it a little bit as well. But I think that covers at least most of what I wanted to cover with CSS modules. One of the things too that I was exploring between these various solutions for CSS was if there's like any inherent performance benefits. We'll get into a little bit of how that happens with styled components, but in particular with CSS modules, there is no inherent performance benefits with CSS modules. It's just CSS files that get imported into your components, and then I think if I open this whole thing in a new window, we can look at the source, find the, there should be a CSS file associated with this. Oh, does Code Sandbox like output it as a, yeah, it looks like it's outputting it as a whole thing. Let's see if I can export this to a zip. In the source. So yeah, I think on the front end, once everything gets all said and done, it's just a style sheet that is applied to your application. There's no inlining of styles. There's no outputting it in the head. There's no specific like anything performance related that CSS modules does. So there you go. That's more or less what's going on with CSS modules and how I understand them at a my understanding of all of this is very beginner level. I'm still trying to get into it and like fully comprehend it. I've used this on a production application before. It was a little while ago, so the syntaxes and things change over time with stuff like this, and obviously Create React App does some very specific stuff with their naming of the CSS files to understand whether or not it's a module or not. Cool. Give me 1 second. I'm going to step away real quick. I'll be back in 1 minute. All right. Sorry about that, folks. Cool. So we've covered kind of just the basics of CSS modules, what they do, what they don't as far as performance, and all that type of stuff. What I'm going to move on to now is a little bit of a deeper topic. CSS and JS is a like super hot button issue, it would appear, for some folks. Nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's one of those things that for whatever reason, like the front end dev community has opinions, like some hardcore opinions about like how to handle CSS in these types of applications. That's why, in the title and in my like tweets and stuff, it's all like hot drama about CSS and JS type of stuff. So yeah, so what we're going to do is just talk about this a little bit. And if you have opinions, I absolutely love to hear opinions from everybody. So drop comments in the chat if you have different experiences with like any of this, and let me know. And I'm like super happy and super interested to talk through this with literally anyone, because it's a really interesting topic. It's something that needs to be talked about, and probably something that needs to be talked about in a little bit more reasonable discourse than like on Twitter, where people just like mash their face into their keyboard complaining about something and don't actually have like a lot of meaningful discussion around it. I'd want to have that meaningful discussion and actually like move forward with, I don't know, not necessarily a consensus, because there's never going to be a consensus, but at least some sort of good conversation about reasons for using something or not. So that's kind of where I stand. I'm open to everything, and I very much enjoy the variety of ways that you can do things in like a React application. I'm going to close out some of this stuff. Cool. So yeah, I very much enjoy the variety and people trying different things. And like one of the things that I've heard specifically about CSS and JavaScript is like that it is a cop out to some people, where they think that whoever enjoys using CSS and JavaScript is someone who doesn't fully grasp CSS and is kind of just treating CSS as a second-class citizen, which is absolutely something that I've seen a little bit of in various React applications. Totally understandable if you are like a JavaScript developer or very focused on React and that type of thing. If you are a React developer, you're going to be focusing much more on the JavaScript side of things, the functionality side of things, like hooking up to APIs, like things that completely go over my head that I'm not super good at. You are, and you're going to be focusing on those things, and that's awesome. And if like you're the only person working on a project, or you're on a team of just JavaScript developers working on a project, then CSS to you is not something that's like a super high priority. So like the general feeling that front-end developers like myself, who have done this for a while, who have, kind of been taught through, whether it's like our education or our self-learning and stuff like that, whether like a boot camp, if you went to a boot camp, like the way that we were taught to do CSS is like inline CSS is bad. Putting CSS in the header through like in the head tag through like a style tag, also gross, kind of bad. The things that we have always been taught has been put it in a style sheet. These things need to remain separate. HTML is different from CSS, is different from JavaScript, and they all kind of need to live in their own little ecosystem. So that's kind of where those folks who are like the old guard of CSS are coming from. And it makes sense. And I totally understand that. I felt that way for a while too. But my dog is like throwing a bone around. Give me 1 second. Hey. Stop throwing the bone. Hey, come on. Come in. Come in. It absolutely never fails that as soon as I start streaming or like doing something where my mic is on, the dogs like freak out and do something that makes it really hard to listen to. So sorry about that. That was a little bit of a rant, but there are a ton of people that are coming into web development from these boot camps, from places of self-learning, React specific type of stuff that don't necessarily understand where people who have been doing this for a while are coming from. And I think it's important that we understand both sides of those things. I ran and now I'm out of breath. It also doesn't help that I'm like ranting a little bit, so I'm like forgetting to breathe. Okay, so that's the preface for CSS and JavaScript. Those are my thoughts and opinions on it. Again, super happy to talk to anybody who has a different experience, different opinions, something else to say. Would absolutely love to hear it. Definitely don't hesitate. But until then, I guess we'll just kind of keep rolling down this tutorial. Cool. So there are a ton of different CSS in JS. When I say a ton, I mean there are several CSS and JS solutions. I suppose that can be seen as a potential downside or a negative when deciding whether or not to use CSS modules or CSS and JS. It is a dependency that you have to add to your project. That dependency has several other dependencies, so you're installing a bunch of node modules in your project, which creates a little bit of overhead. But the things that CSS and JS does, I think, are worth it. I tend to like to carefully examine the modules that I'm adding to my project and figure out why I'm adding them and how it benefits my project, and if the pros outweigh the cons of like the compile time and the bundled size of the project and all of that type of stuff. So that is something to keep in mind. You will need to add some dependencies. So there are, like I said, there are several solutions. The one that I'm going to be going over is styled components. Don't remember what they're. It's just styledcomponents.com. Styled components. The reason that I like to use styled components in particular, on the front page of their site, you'll see an example of how to use a styled component. You can see that within, and I'll explain kind of like the syntax and everything here in a minute, but you can tell right off the bat that within a styled component, you are writing straight up CSS. I moved something. There is nothing. Did I actually edit that? Can you edit that thing? Oh boy, you can. I broke it. Okay. You can tell that you're just straight up writing CSS, which is a huge benefit. With something like emotion, you can see that from their examples, and this is just a personal preference. If you use emotion, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I do not personally like how the CSS is added directly into this class name here. I'm sure that you can probably set this to like a const or a variable or something like that, and then write the CSS inside of that const. Going off of the examples that they have on the homepage, though, this feels weird to me. I am one of the old guard people trying to protect a little bit of the CSS that I know and love and grew up writing, This deviates a little bit too much from that for me. But again, just a personal preference. There are other CSS and JavaScript solutions that make it hard to write normal CSS, normal in quotation marks, CSS that I'm used to. Some will not allow you to use dashes, and you have to do camel case background color, all one word. That's not CSS. That feels weird to me. deviates a little bit too far from what I'm used to, so I steer away from those types of things as well. So yeah, emotion's another option. It's not terrible, and again, I imagine, like I said, as you can see here, there is an example of them doing more or less what styled components is doing. And actually, I remember reading somewhere, now that I'm talking about this, probably on the documentation of one of these two sites, they share a little bit of, I guess, like information between their two projects. So you can see that with the emotion styled package, which is apparently a deviation from just normal emotion, you can write very similar CSS to, or exactly the same CSS that is in styled components. I think that styled components uses the styled syntax from emotion, where it like either imports that package directly or uses the same concepts to achieve it. But in any case, I like the way styled components works. I like, I've used it a little bit and I enjoy it. So I don't see anything wrong with it. But again, try everything. You know, if something works better for you, absolutely nothing wrong with that. They're all doing essentially the same thing. So cool. So that's the quick background on styled components. I'm trying to figure out what the best like time to talk about some of these things is. In any case, I guess let's talk about like the output and stuff. So like I said, with CSS modules, you're essentially just outputting a CSS file that gets imported and applied as a class to your elements. I want to go back to that actually real quick and just make sure that I'm not like a bold-faced liar here. Yeah, I believe that this wait, where'd it go? I guess does the CSS just get like bundled up with the JavaScript and all that? I ran some tests on this earlier and just like on my local machine actually spun up like a React project and figured out how these things were being imported. I'm like 90% sure that it's just like generating a style sheet, and that style sheet is linked to in your application. So cool. Doesn't matter. Great. All right. So I'm going to kind of get started with styled components. So let's just remove any reference to normal CSS that exists in here. Just get this to a straight up HTML file with no styles associated with it. Lovely. That was easy. Great. Okay. Styled components. Adding that as a dependency. Code Sandbox is pretty cool in that it's just like a really easy way to like add dependencies and stuff. I've not used this very much, so I'm going to be enamored with it for a second. But yeah, pretty neat how you can just add different versions of the dependencies and all that type of stuff. So great job, Code Sandbox. Cool. So I've added styled components as a dependency to my project. I should be able to now just straight up import styled components. So doing the same thing, and I'm going to just kind of cheat a little bit and steal you know what? No, I'm not, because too much is going to change. I am going to approach this in a little bit of a different way. One of the things that I do like about styled components in particular is, for me personally, it kind of forces you to think about like why you're styling things the way that you're styling them, and it kind of forces you to componentize, which is probably not a word, but it forces you to componentize things a little bit better. Because like I mean right now, like I could very easily, let's just kind of like run this scenario through, right? So if I were to import styled I believe it's styled from styled components. I could just super simply import that, create a const button that is a styled.button. This is the syntax for styled components. And before I move too much further, let me explain this a little bit. The way that styled components works is you are essentially creating an element that styled components is going to output as whatever this second parameter in your styled object is. So you can, any HTML DOM element that you can think of, you can have styled, anything that's stylable. You can have styled components output. So if I wanted this button to, for whatever weird reason, be a table, you can do that, or a div, you can do that. You can output any DOM element that you want this component to end up being. What's also cool about this is you can have this button essentially act as a higher order component. It's a little bit more of a complex React topic, but essentially you can wrap stuff in your higher order component. So let's say we wanted this button to be a div that is just a very simple background color red, just so that we have it there. You can set this button up so that you output the button. You then can put anything that you want in this, a title, a paragraph, anything. You can put further divs, you can nest components in this button. The definition of the button const here is essentially just a React higher order component. Nest anything you want in there and it's done. There are many like little nuances to style components that make it super interesting. But it does all follow the same logic of like normal HTML and CSS that you would be used to. This is essentially, I'm not sure if, I feel like I'm dating myself now, but like if you've used like XML and stuff before, you're essentially creating XML tags here, and then you can wrap those tags with anything, or you can nest anything within those tags and pretty much just name any of your DOM elements whatever you want. I like that a lot. That makes it feel, to maybe talk about like a newer technology, fairly like web component-y to me, which is cool. You can pretty much create your own little component, compartmentalize it, componentize it, and then be on your way. So that's kind of just a very quick rundown of the syntax for getting like a super basic div. And if we pop this out into its own thing, inspect the element here, you can see that by default, so we're outputting the div, the H1 and the P are being wrapped by that div. The class name is hashed just like it was in CSS modules. Very, very similar to what we've worked with already. Before I move on, let me check what Wabbit said here. Stuff like style div is one reason I prefer CSS modules. I'm very interested in understanding easily what div elements are being rendered like at the leaf level. Wabbit, I'm not sure I understand what the leaf level is. I apologize. With style components, there is a level of indirection. Is this a tiled component or some custom component? I totally understand that sentiment. At least it does feel a little bit weird. I definitely, I will give you that for sure. To me personally, though, we're writing CSS in the context of a React application, right? So we're in this land of JavaScript already, doing a whole bunch of stuff to essentially just output HTML and JavaScript, right? So introducing CSS into that mix doesn't feel too weird to me not to use something like this. this feels easier to me to write, and I've used CSS modules in the past. I've not used styled components on like a production level project or anything like that, but I was able to get this up and running very easily without much confusion about like the class names and stuff like that. So that just right off the bat feels a little bit better to me. I'm going to butcher this name, but Sergio? Is it, yeah, I guess it's Sergio. Thanks for the follow, man. I appreciate it. So yeah, in any case, this initially feels a little bit better to me. And again, it's just a personal thing. If CSS modules works better for you, if this syntax or this methodology is a little bit too weird for you, I totally get it. We live in a weird, when implementing CSS into these React projects, we live in a weird world. It's all a little bit strange. It's just kind of like, this is just the most opinionated thing that you can do in a React application, it seems like, because there are so many different solutions and so many different ways that people think. For whatever reason, this clicks with me a little bit more. This gives me a little bit more control over how I output my component. Very easy for me to switch between a div and a button, and that type of thing. I don't think it's weird. I think it makes my brain think more than it does with CSS modules. I haven't created an extra level of indirection. Sure. No, and that totally makes sense. I'm probably projecting the weirdness on this a little bit, because to me it does feel very weird regardless of the route that we take. But no, I totally get that. If it in your brain, if it makes you have to think more than you feel like you should to just write HTML and CSS in a React context, totally get it. I understand for sure. And I will say too, I'm absolutely not I'm not going to advocate for one of these things over the other. You use what you feel like is best, makes most sense to you. I just find all of these things very interesting, and so far, from what I've tried, this has clicked with me personally the best. And I'll get into this a little bit more as we continue down this path a little bit. Yeah, you know what? Let me save this thought that I have in my head until we get a little closer to being finished with this, so that I don't take too much time ranting anymore. All right, cool. So this is just a very basic implementation of what we want here. I'm going to remove the stuff within here. I'm going to remove completely our button for right now. Well, actually, let's just get something on the screen here. Let's do button, then inside of that button, we'll just say click me. And we want, two of those. Cool, so we got two buttons, blah, blah, blah. Lovely. One of the things, that I forgot to go over just a little bit in CSS modules, this will just be a super quick little aside. If you're, working on a project, you need to add like some global styles. We kind of did this with style.css with the app. Somewhat, although CSS modules, I believe, require you to do global styles. Let's just double check this, because if we had something that we wanted to share between absolutely everything in our CSS modules project, if we had a heading class that we wanted to target every single H1 in any component, and not necessarily hash the class on that. Let me double check before I go into this too far. CSS modules, global styles. Let's just make sure that I do this properly. Not not helpful. CSS module, where to put global element styles. Is it just that global? Let's just give this a try in styles. If I have a global H1, see, the nesting thing doesn't work, right? So yeah, like that's, oh boy. Oh, we're going to go on a little adventure here, folks. Sorry about that. Definitely, like, if you've done this before, Wabbit, it seems like you have. If you've done this before and you've written some global styles, yell at me. Let me know if I'm doing something silly or just, like, wasting time. Yeah, okay, yeah, so we got multiple class names. Let's just find global. Oh boy, global. Tag names, that's not helpful. The style will be global. Notice how the button class. Okay, let's give that a try. Global H1. Oops. H1. It's not yelling at me yet. Okay, so we do that, and then we go into the index. Let's just add a H1. Hello? Oh, you're not red, you monster. Is it like outputting anything at all? Negative. Shoot. Oh, I was convinced that was going to work, Wabbit. Let's see. Okay, this is like way too long of an article. I just need create React app CSS modules global styles. Oh. Parentheses? Is it that easy? Please be that easy. All right, let's try it straight up on with a class. And then if I were to just add class name equals no luck there either. I'm importing styles still. Global H1. Oh boy. See, this is one thing. Background color red. Yep. In that case, it's just dot H1. Try global H1. Okay, I see. Gotcha, without the parentheses. Lies. Oh, man. Class name, H1. Styles, global, H1. Weird. No, I appreciate you. I appreciate you trying to help me walk through that, man. Interesting. I could have sworn. that would work. I can't. It's been a minute since I've worked with CSS modules, and I cannot remember for the life of me how to get like a global style sheet going in there. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely do that. Let's give that a shot. In index, before we return anything, let's just console log. Oops. Although, okay, so Wabbit, this may be a part of the thing. So like the class name that I was trying to apply globally is in just straight up styles.css, not necessarily in my module, my CSS module component. Maybe that's it. Maybe I'm just kind of silly, right? So like, can I just do H1 in here and call color red? Wow, look at how hard that was. Oh, that's embarrassing. Okay, so there we go. If you're, oh boy. Thanks for walking through that with me, Wabbit. Yep, appreciate that. That's how silly. Okay, so yeah, we are just very normally importing a style sheet into our app component. We can just write normal CSS and it will be global. There doesn't need to be, I overthought that way too hard. Cool. So yeah, adding global styles, if you're, I guess the way to think about this then. So I'm going to take this one step further. I'm so sorry. Bear with me. Let's do color green as just a normal class here. That changes the text color to green. If I wanted to do that, can I then just do class name equals color green? Okay, cool. Lovely. So there you go. Global styles. Just put it in a normal style sheet. Throw it in a normal style sheet. Import it normally. You can use CSS like you could in the 90s. Very, very easily. Sweet. So yeah, I just overcomplicated that way too much. Thank you again, Wabbit, for your help there. I appreciate that. All right, cool. So there you go. Global styles. Add them to the style sheet. Good to go. That is definitely a if you don't overthink it like I did, a nice, easy way to handle global styles in a CSS module world within Create React App here. If you have these module files, you can just straight up put normal CSS files in there and it'll act as a global style sheet. So if you needed to put like a normalized.css or a reset, like a CSS reset or anything like that, you could import it normally just through the CSS. Saying global, H1 is correct if you wanted to create a global class name, a string that is global and could be used anywhere. Don't know why this doesn't work in your setup here. Yeah, I think that it's because I wasn't doing it in a CSS file that this React application recognizes as a CSS module file. It's like, I bet you if we were to go into here and like do global .h1 as a class name and then make it color pink, and then go into our index and do color pink, then we should be fine. Yeah, so it was just where I was throwing that global flag, because it wasn't in a technical CSS module file that by default Create React App here works through. That's why it wasn't working. So this global flag allows you to, within any CSS module file, throw the global flag, put a class name in there, and then you can have yourself a global class that works everywhere just by way of normal string class names. Interesting. That is definitely good to know. That is I'm glad we all learned here today, including me. That was interesting. So lovely. So I think that should take care of everything. We won't have to jump back from styled components now. Apologies for that sidebar there, but definitely good to know how to do global styles there. Awesome. So back to styled components. I'm going to switch my brain around here. Cool. So we set up our styled button as an HTML element button. I will make sure that I don't forget to go over global styling within styled components. It is a little bit weird, but not terribly so. But in any case, we'll get to that in a minute. All right, let's set up a bit of file structure here. Components. I'm going to set this up in a way that this button is its own component. Part of the thing that I do, I'm saying too much. I apologize. It's the not good public speaker in me. I want this button to be its own component. Part of what I like about styled components is it does make me think a little bit more critically about abstracting components. Abstracting a button kind of makes sense. It feels like it may be a little too like meta, but depending on what this button needs to do, in our case, let's just say it makes sense to abstract this button out and make it its own component. So cool, great. So I have a components folder that is going to house our actual, not button.js. I will also create a new directory that is styles. Within styles, create a components directory. I like to, that I'm seeing my brain is actually in CSS Modules world here. I'm going to leave this styles directory empty for now, and I'll get to why I like to have this in a minute. Okay, so we have a button component. Let's just make a normal React button here. I'm just going to import these things. Actually, I don't think that we should need that. So let's do import styled from styled components. Oh, did not autocomplete for me. There you go. Import styled from styled components. I am going to set up a button through the styled syntax. So styled button. Do the backticks here. And then we should be off to the races. Oops. Let me go ahead and just copy and paste some of this stuff in here. One thing that is nice, certainly not like use styled components because of this type of thing, but fingers crossed, let's just make sure that this works. You should be able to do all of like the post CSS nesting and variable names and stuff like that within styled components by default. So if I wanted to add a hover to this button, it's not yelling at me yet, which is good news. You can straight up use nesting if you're familiar with Sass or SCSS. I've been using post CSS to handle like the actual it used to be CSS Next, but that got deprecated. So that rolled into post CSS, where it actually is taking standards from the W3C that are proposed standards for how CSS is going to work. It takes those standards and applies them to post CSS. Styled components reflects that similarly. I haven't explored it fully to know if like if you've used post CSS before or CSS Next, there's like a nest selector where you can do complex nesting selectors. So like if you wanted to target a child element only if it has a parent elements class, then you would do nest and thing and then write your styles in there. I'm not sure if styled components handles that. But at a basic level, it does handle nesting like I am used to personally. Let's see together if it also handles variables. That doesn't make sense. Red. It looks like it does. So if you are used to using SAS variables in this way, it appears that that works. So that's good to know. Let me grab the hex for this real quick. Let's see how it handles actual like CSS variables. Primary. Bar primary. Looks like it handles that as well. So good to know. Interesting. Okay, cool. Good to know. Great. So we've got that. Let me just copy over the rest of the styles here. If we have a empty variation here with the dash. Oops, here we go. Empty variation, and then the empty variation also needs a hover state. Just copy that. Do one of those. Great. So we've essentially here just mirrored pretty much everything. We need to make sure that we export default button from this file so that we can get at it elsewhere. Go ahead and save that. Cool. So yeah, we've essentially just recreated the styles, same styles that we had in here. We were able to nest, do hover states, all of that type of stuff here fairly easily as well. So that's great. Let's get rid of this and then import button from it should be /components button. Awesome. So now I guess here's where we run into a conundrum, right? So we're not working with a normal HTML element. We're working with essentially a React component. This is one of the things that I discovered recently that kind of weirds me out a little. Not something that I'm a super huge fan of, where it's like very easy to add like modifier class names to things. But what we can do, and this, it's a double-edged sword here for sure, because I do think that this can be fairly powerful. Having access to props in CSS is something that's interesting, but that is what we can do. So if we wanted to, I don't know, pass a variation prop to this and call it empty, we could do that, because like I said, by default, there's no way for us to just straight up add like a class name of -empty and wait a minute. I didn't think that was going to work. How interesting. Huh. Well, okay. That proved me wrong real quick. I wonder what that's doing under the hood, because like if I Does that work with like normal React components? Because like if I were to, hold on one second. All right, let's run a test here, folks. All right, if I wanted a heading for whatever reason component, and I import React from React. I don't think that I'll need React DOM here, but I guess we'll find out. And then just did const heading equals just a normal stateless functional component. That, oh boy, come on, keyboard skills. Let's just implicitly return an H1. Hello. Export default heading. Just a straight up normal component. Nothing crazy there. If I imported that heading here. Wait, why are you mad at me? Identifier button has already been declared. Oh. Import heading from heading and do heading. Do like that. Like if I were to just straight up add a class name to this, is it going to output the class name? Empty. Let's pop that open in a new tab. It's not. Oh, interesting. Okay. Huh. So this is good to know. So it appears, I don't know everything about React. I know enough to be able to talk about it and do stuff with it, but I figured that because this button was a React component, that we couldn't just straight up pass a class name to the React component and have that React component handle the class name and know what to do with it. As we can see, by default with a stateless functional component, nothing's going to happen here if we add a class name to a component because that component doesn't know how to handle it. With styled components, it appears that you can pass a class name to the component, but it does not scope that style by default. So it doesn't create like a hashed version of this class name, but what it does do is it attaches that class name to the hashed class name that it has already generated for your button component. That's cool. I kind of like that. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this heading. So that's interesting. I don't know if this is like super helpful for you folks watching to watch me like stumble through some of this, but talking about it and like learning this stuff together is super fun and cool for me. So I appreciate you hanging out with me here while I do this. This is super interesting and fun. So I learned something here just now. Interesting way that styled components handles class names like this. So that's cool. Great. I thought I was going to have to do a little bit more to get this variation class applied, but we are done with our button component. It works just like I'd expect it. All the styles are there. Everything is good. I can delete that because we don't need to import styled there. So that's cool. Very interesting. I like that. That's just a very basic example of how to handle a button component. Now to kind of circle back onto the global styles thing. Styled components handles, let me close a couple of these other tabs. Styled components handles global styles, global. Okay. Styled components, global styles. There are, so if you are interested in styled components in particular, the docs are super interesting. They have a lot of like interesting methods for doing things. Theming is one of those things. A lot of sites, a lot of apps, a lot of things nowadays have like a light and dark mode. Some of those things are dependent on the Mac feature of whether or not you've chosen to prefer light or dark mode. You can write some pretty cool CSS to, it's essentially a media query that detects the preference of the user, and then you can set like a light or a dark theme based on that. You can do that at a per component level with styled components. As I was mentioning, styled components gives you access to props. So you can pass any prop down to your button component, and then within the backticks of your CSS, you can access those props. I forgot the proper name for this, but you have to essentially write a function to get the props object and then drill down into that object to get the prop that you're looking for. Let's look at the HTML provided here. So styled components offers, and some of this could certainly be considered bloat if you're not like interested in using this theme provider stuff or theming in general. I can totally understand that argument that against styled components for that reason. Bloat is certainly something to keep in mind. However, you do have access to this theme provider, again, higher order component that you can then pass. They did it in a little bit of a deeply nested way just to, I guess, display how to get at the props object. But they're passing down the theme through the theme provider, and then any child element within that theme provider is going to have access to the props passed down by the theme provider. So just an interesting thing that you can do there with styled components. They get into a lot of interesting things that you can do with styled components, but we are looking for global styles. This is I hate that this popped into view here, but it's worth talking about. The way that styled components actually outputs the CSS on the page. So instead of writing out a CSS file, instead of inlining directly into the elements, the CSS, you can see that there are class names that are being referenced by each of these individual components. What styled components does is actually outputs the styles in a style tag in the head. I explained that this used to be a little bit gross, or at least feel a little bit gross, but I don't think there's any like giant argument against it. In any case, that's what styled components does. To me, that's sort of a con, but a con that I can overlook just because of preference. However, within here, you can see that there's data attributes that are specific to styled components that styled components understands and reads and does whatever with. It also shows the the hashed class name for the component in a comment, and then outputs stuff for that component. Oh, that's weird. Maybe the style component ID is different than the actual class name that it outputs. Yeah, it looks like it. But yeah, so it does that. You can see, though, if you look closely, that it does also do auto prefixing. I want to know if CSS Modules does that by default as well. It doesn't look like... Yeah, doesn't look like it does. That's something you can fairly easily add to CSS modules through like your Webpack config and stuff like that. So not a huge deal, just an interesting tidbit. does this by default, outputs the browser prefixes, stuff like that for you. Yeah, that is the gist of how styled components outputs CSS on the page. A couple pros and cons to that specifically. With styled components, by default, you are getting critical CSS. So what that means is that only the CSS that is needed by the components that are loaded on the page is output. So right now, like if I were to have that heading component in my project, but not called on this app, on this index page, it was called somewhere else, the CSS for that component would not be output in that until that component is mounted on the page. That is something that I do quite like. Critical CSS is cool, and the fact that styled components does that by default is also interesting, because normally, unless you were working in a I come from a WordPress background, so like if I was working on a WordPress website and I don't have super great Webpack chops or anything like that, it was always kind of a pain, and especially in a WordPress sense, it was extremely a pain to figure out what the critical CSS was and then output either a style sheet or inline styles or a style tag in the header with those critical styles in it. That was always a pain. So this way of thinking that styled components does here is interesting to me, and a decent use case for styled components. Where that potentially does fall down, and again, I have not worked on this in a production environment, but where that does potentially fall down is, like, imagine if you had a giant application with, thousands and thousands of lines of CSS, like styles and stuff like that, that are loaded up on the homepage. If you have a ton of components that are completely styled differently, then you could start to experience some performance degradation by outputting all of that CSS in the head here. It seems like it's very easy to abuse that within a styled components context. So something worth considering. However, for someone like me who puts a lot of stock in CSS, and I try to think very, very critically about how I'm using my CSS, if I were to see that my application was outputting that much CSS to the point where having hard-coded CSS in the head here started to degrade performance of my application, I would start to very seriously assess how I was styling my application and why styles couldn't be reused, or how I could reuse components in places so that so many styles weren't being output. So kind of a double-edged sword there as well. Some pros and cons to it for sure. But yeah, if used thoughtlessly, I feel like styled components could potentially be a problem for you. But if used thoughtfully, I think that folks like us who take a lot of stock, put a lot of stock in CSS and pride ourselves on our CSS skills and stuff like that, if we thoughtfully use something like styled components, I feel like it could give us some pretty interesting and cool benefits within the context of a React application. I told you this was going to be like philosophical hour of talking about these CSS things. So yeah, I love talking about this stuff though. So cool. Great. So moving on to actually the thing that we were talking about, which is global styling. Let me go back here. Okay. So when we first started here, I created this styles directory, and here is why. This is where I like to put all of my global styles. On normal projects, I would generally, that's why I created, just out of habit, the components folder within this styles directory. I normally would, put each individual, all of the individual styles for each individual component in their own CSS file, import those CSS files individually, and then go from there. But because we are Doing that all through styled components, that is no longer necessary. However, I do like to maintain the same structure that I'm used to and that my team is used to in an application like this. So styles directory at the root of the project. Within here, we can now start dumping our global styles. So one of the things that this is true for CSS modules as it is with styled components. This is just a structural architectural thing that I tend to like to do. The difference here though is just going to be the file endings. So what I generally like to do is set up a base. That is a file, not a folder. Let's get out of that. Create a directory, call that base. So I have a base directory, and in that base directory is where I put all of my, if I was working in a WordPress context, all of my like WordPress default stylings for like align left, align right, all that type of stuff if you're familiar with WordPress. In addition, you can put in here things like variables, right? And we can do this on both of these things if we really wanted, right? So on our CSS modules, I'll also create a base, and then within here we can create just normal CSS files that are like variables.css. And just for the sake of example, let's pretend we're working in a WordPress context and do WordPress styles.css. And I'm not going to make these modules because I'm just going to straight up import them in my CSS module here. But we're just creating normal CSS files for our global styles here. Where it gets weird with styled components is that within base here, I will create a file that is variables. Then the first time I did this, I felt gross, but it ends up working okay. So variables, variables.js. That's weird and gross to me at the moment, but it ends up feeling okay. So we'll do the same for WordPress.js. Now, within styled components, since we're here, we'll just talk about this real quick. Within styled components, there are a couple of different ways, and you can search through the documentation on styled components. They do have examples. I just couldn't find them quickly in here, but I do know just how to do this off the top of my head. There are a couple different ways that you can inject global styles into the same area in the head as everything else. So let's just do like a really generic WordPress class. The way that you do this in styled components, though, there is a method essentially that you import from styled components. Import, and it's just called CSS from styled components. You import CSS from styled components. This essentially makes it so that you don't have to define a button or a div or attach that object onto the end of your styled object. It essentially allows us to just, and I'm just going to straight up export this here. This is also where it starts to get a little bit weird, but as we move forward, this will make sense. So in any case, just bear with me here for a moment. I'm going to export a const that is an object that is WordPress global styles, right? So I'm just going to call this const WordPress. And in here, I am going to say CSS. Just use our little function that we imported here, our method that we imported there. And then within here, I will just do a very simple align center class. Within that align center class, we'll just do some basic normal like clear fix stuff, clear both, text align center. If it's not just straight up text, we can just do margin 0, auto. What else am I missing? I guess just display block, right? Just make sure that whatever, if it's like a link or something like that, we can just display block. Great. So super basic WordPress object that has many classes inside of it that are going to act as global classes. We'll save that. within our variables.js. Still weird to say that. Hey, Winter, thanks for the follow. Appreciate it. Within this variables file here, we will define some like color variables, much like we already have in our button. If you want to do it this way, you can. You can also define through CSS variables, which is a way that I like doing it. I like to use as many normal, quote unquote, normal, standardized, I guess, ways of writing CSS. CSS variables is one of those ways. I very much enjoy doing that. I do want to see how it handles this. So it essentially, okay. So it just outputs it. It doesn't do anything weird with it. Okay. So one of the things you'll have to keep in mind if you are using CSS variables within your styled components here, you will have to realize that these won't work in like IE 11 if you have to support that. If you don't have to support that, consider yourself extremely lucky. But if you do have to support it, you will either have to polyfill it, which will probably adjust how you define these CSS variables. But know that it is an option here. So moving on, instead of doing it in here, and we'll just do it a couple. We'll keep this primary color here. Let's do this. We're just going to call this like, oops, in variables. I am going to, again, this is going to look and feel a little bit weird if you're used to CSS, but it'll make sense in a minute. So export const, and I'm just going to call this light gray or something like that. And we're just going to do a normal string that has did I copy the whole thing? I did. Cool. So I'm setting a variable to, I'm defining a light gray variable, setting that variable to just the string of the CSS that I want it to be, which is this light gray. And then going along my way, let's just do a couple more. Why can't I find button? There it is. Okay. Let's just do these other classes here. Export const dark gray. This is essentially black, but we'll just call it dark gray. But what else do we got in button? We'll just call this one normal gray. Just gray. That works for me. So in this JavaScript file, I'm exporting all of these individually so that I can get at them if I want to get at them individually in another component. So if from the button component, I wanted to very specifically import just normal gray. Oh, what button did I push here? There we go. Okay. If I just wanted to import one color from those variables, I can import gray from where am I here? I need to go up a level, into styles, into variables. Into base, then variables. So if I just wanted to import one thing from this variable file, I could do that through just our destructured import here. I could then straight up set this to because we're in a template literal here, I have to escape out of just normal CSS that it understands and then call gray. Except I have to make sure that I use the right spelling. And there you go. So empty has the correct, it should be, what was that, 666? Yeah. So empty has the correct color based on a variable that I imported from the variables file. It feels a little weird, but once you kind of get used to it, it makes sense. It's very similar to what you would do in CSS modules, right? So if you were to just set some CSS variables on a like root, like if we were just doing like normal CSS variables within CSS modules, I could just we'll just do 1 here so that you can get the gist of it. But gray is going to be 666. Save that. Then in our index, we can import styles / base / nope, I said base / variables. Right, styles.base / variables. And then I am wrong here. We're going to need to import that. Oh, oops. This is interesting. I remember. So when using CSS modules, I believe you can import different files into each individual module file. So like if you very specifically needed to, if you're using any variables that we've defined in that variables file within your button module here, you can import base variables. And then you should hopefully have access to the variables that are set within here, and we should be able to do var -- gray. Am I incorrect? Interesting. Let's see what happens if I just import it. There you go. Yep. Thanks, Wabbit. That makes sense. So instead of importing it directly into your button, I was just completely wrong. Sorry about that. Import it straight into your index or wherever you're using your component, and you then have access to the file that houses that variable. Thank you again, Wabbit. I appreciate that. Cool. So yeah, that's just pretty much how you'll get at global CSS files in your CSS modules application. Switching back over to style components, just real quick. Another thing that I like to do, and this is again just kind of a preference thing, and this will wrap up what we have here for now. But one of the things that I do like to do is create inside of these kind of drilled down lower level directories, put an index file. And this again is just a personal way that I like to structure my CSS, my JavaScript CSS in here. But what you can do is, hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. What you can do is export your partials from within base here. So we can export everything from variables and export everything from WordPress. And then everything that we've exported through these files should be available to us if we were to go into our button and then just import gray from base. Or in addition, I guess what you could do is if you wanted to like export const colors and then make this an object. This is just, again, something that as I was exploring how to use styled components, this made me feel the most comfortable. So you can export light gray, dark gray, and gray into this colors object in your button. Then you can import all of the colors, because assuming that you're going to, like, you definitely don't want, it would be very annoying to have to do like gray, light gray, dark gray. And if you had, 10 colors in here that you needed to use, that would be fairly frustrating. So I like to import colors from here, and then this should give me access to all of the colors that we have defined. I have light gray. This is actually supposed to be dark gray. It needs to be from the object of colors though, colors.dark gray. Let me get rid of all of this stuff too. Sorry about that. Cool, so we've got colors dark gray everywhere that we're hitting 111. What are you yelling at me about? Gray is not defined. Oh, it's because I have colors.gray. There we go. And then within here, this one is the light gray. A little bit weird, certainly, especially to me, especially coming from normal CSS. Normal, I keep saying normal, like this isn't becoming the norm. Traditional CSS, the CSS that I'm used to. Definitely feels a little bit weird, but these things that I've explained, and part of the reason that I spent so much time specifically on styled components is you can, through the help of Wabbit, again, I appreciate your help there, with CSS modules, you can essentially just write normal CSS. If you hate CSS in JavaScript, if you've tried it, you don't like it, if it doesn't make sense to you, I didn't need to spend too much time on CSS modules because it does everything that you're used to. There is a little bit of, I guess, extra work that you need to do as far as the build tools for like setting up Webpack to understand all CSS files if that's what you want, or to utilize post CSS and stuff like that. We've had to do that for a while, ever since Webpack has become a thing. So that shouldn't be like too terribly crazy of news to anyone, and shouldn't be like a huge problem. CSS modules is just CSS. It allows you to import your CSS to various components and you're good to go. So that is why I didn't spend a whole lot of time on CSS modules here talking about this right now. That's just because it's normal CSS, normal traditional CSS. There's a lot of interesting nuances, I guess, to styled components. If you were someone jumping into this project, I have a lot of faith in the people that I work with for sure, but in our community in general, that if I were to hand this project over with a styles folder in it that mimics the folder structure that they're used to, the file names that they're used to, the variables, the way they're set up, a little bit different, but I feel like a person who has inherited this project would be able to understand what they're getting. It's using something that's a little bit new in styled components. CSS and JavaScript is a little bit new, but they would be able to, through this organization and thought, hopefully be able to understand what's happening in this project. It is very easy to just dump all of this into your index.js and output all of that CSS and like make a 300-line JavaScript file where you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom to actually get at the component markup. Very easy to do that with styled components, but part of the reason that I wanted to talk about what I've learned in my strategies and stuff for this is to just kind of hopefully illuminate that, like, if you do enjoy using something like this, but there are people that you work with, or, if for whatever reason, if you're like a contractor or something like that, and you're building a project that someone else is going to inherit, understand that this styled components way of doing things is like definitely weird and scary to some of the people that aren't used to this. So the thoughtfulness behind some of the stuff that we did here, I think, is like beneficial for everyone to take and translate to their own system, their own project, and kind of keep passing that forward. So I think, let me check my notes here and make sure that I went over everything that I wanted. We got CSS Module, we got all that, create a button, global styles, Variables, yeah. So I think that covers everything that I wanted to cover in the code here today. I'll save these. These are like super basic code sandbox things, but I will here. Let me drop this. Let me figure out how to share from code sandbox. Share editor. Yeah, here we go. So this one is the styled components. I'm just going to drop these links into chat. Components. And then CSS modules. Oh man, if I could spell modules. I'll drop both of those into chat. Do it a couple times so that they're right there for you. Feel free to, take these, bookmark these if any of this information was helpful to you. Play with them, fork them, all of that type of stuff. I guess as we're wrapping up here, does anyone have any thoughts, any questions in chat, any qualms with how I explained things, or opinions that I have, or opinions that you have? If this was helpful, let me know. That's nice too. Always nice to know that this at least helped somebody, or at least was interesting or entertaining for you. Yeah, I'll just kind of give it a minute if anyone has anything. Otherwise, we'll wrap this up. Cool. Well, yeah. In any case, like I said, all of this stuff is interesting, and nothing more or nothing less. Like, it's not, there is so much hot drama on like Twitter and everything, and just in the community in general, and between members of teams in companies and just individuals in general. Like, there's so much. I don't want to be like super mean and be like, there's so much closed-mindedness. I'm not sure that it's necessarily closed-mindedness. It's just aversion, I guess, to something like this, like CSS and JavaScript in particular, that deviates so far from the norm that people are used to. There's just a lot of aversion to that people feel. And for whatever reason, that feeling bubbles up and turns into, classic Twitter arguments and people just being fairly like rude and stuff to each other. But there's nothing to this type of thinking, of this type of way of doing things, is not something that's worth like getting all crazy and super offended about if someone likes this way of doing things over that way of doing things. So I personally have very much enjoyed like exploring this and talking to a bunch of people on my team at 10up about like their opinions on this and how they feel CSS and JavaScript falls short, why they feel that way, their concerns around it, all of that type of stuff. Wabbit, I absolutely very much appreciate your viewpoint in the chat here today. Your help as well. That was great. I appreciate you helping me to not stumble as much as I probably would have. But yeah, this was super fun for me, super informative. I learned a couple of things while we were rolling through this together. So yeah, I am probably going to call it here. Hopefully you guys had at least found this interesting. But yeah, cool. Thanks so much for joining. I'm going to try much harder to stay on a legit like schedule for streaming stuff like this. Hopefully I can commit to like once a week, figuring out a topic and talking about it. Let me know on Twitter or wherever if you have like a subject that you're super interested in talking about or walking through or anything like that as well. If you're not following me here on Twitch, please do that as well so that you can be notified too when I go live, and we can hang out and do more fun stuff like this. So again, thank you so much for joining me here today, and I hope you folks have a great weekend. All right, we'll talk to you later.